The first thing the system told me about her was that she didn't exist. That's not unusual at Cathara Station. About a third of the intake cases that come through Bay 9 arrive without valid identity chips, cracked housings, corrupted data cores, chips cut out by traffickers, who sell the designation numbers separately and move the bodies through under false manifests. We have a word for those cases: unclaimed. The system flags them in amber, routes them to a holding queue, and after 90 standard days with no sponsor, no nation of origin, and no biological match in the galactic registry, it routes them again, this time to transit purge, which is a bureaucratic way of saying they get loaded onto an outbound freight corridor with a temporary or humanitarian number and deposited at the nearest welfare station, which at this end of the Kethera Reach is a repurposed mining platform called Outpost Grieve that smells like ammonia and has a 2-year waiting list. Basic housing. I've been working intake at Window 3 for 11 years. I know what the amber flag means. I know what transit purge means. I have closed more unclaimed cases than I want to count, and each one has its own particular weight that I have learned to carry without letting it slow me down. Because if I slowed down, there would be 40 cases behind the one I was slowing over, and none of those people can afford for me to stop. I did not close hers. I want to be honest about why, because I've been asked the question enough times now that I've had to sit with my own answer and turn it over. It wasn't that she was beautiful, though she was in the way that something rare and damaged is beautiful. The way you look at a piece of old machinery that should have been scrapped and realize the tolerances are finer than anything being made today. It wasn't pity exactly. Pity would have been easier. Pity has a clean shape. You feel it, you act on it, or you don't, and then you move on. This was something else. Something simpler and harder to articulate. She was sitting in the intake chair in Bay 9 on a gray transit blanket someone had draped over her shoulders. And she was looking at the wall across from her, with the focused blankness of someone who has learned to make the middle distance a safe place to be. And I pulled up her intake form, and there was nothing there except a body weight, a rough species classification, velhari subtype, which I'd seen maybe twice in my career, and the notation, designation chip absent. Case flagged unclaimed. She turned her head and looked at me. Eyes were the color of pale gold, almost amber but lighter, and the pupils were vertical, the way velhari eyes are. And she had ash-gray skin with a faint blue cast to it at the temples and jaw, and her hair was black, growing out from what had been a very close crop, uneven now, the way hair looks when it hasn't been attended to in months. She had a bruise along her left cheekbone that was healing, gone to yellow-green. She looked like she had been through something that she hadn't fully arrived back from yet. And she was assessing me the way you assess something when you can't afford to be wrong about it. She looked at me the way you look at something when you're deciding whether it's a threat. I held up both hands, palms out. I don't know if that gesture means anything in velhari body language. It might mean something entirely different, for all I knew. She watched my hands, and then she watched my face, and something in her posture eased by a fraction of a degree. I said, in the 4 transit language variants my translation unit carries, my name is Dale. I'm going to try to help you. Can you understand any of these words? She didn't answer. The translation unit registered no language match response. Tried the variants one more time, more slowly, and watched her face while I did it. Expression said she was listening hard but nothing was landing. Not incomprehension exactly. More like trying to hear something through too much interference, like a frequency just slightly out of range. I noted the non-response, marked the language field as an unresolved investigation, and made a decision I hadn't entirely made consciously until I was already doing it. I flagged her file for active hold rather than standard processing queue, and I left a note in the case log that read, in the bland official language I have gotten very good at using. Subject requires extended intake assessment. Proceeding with non-standard protocol. Filed my first extension on her case that evening. 90-day hold. Reason listed as insufficient identity data. Active investigation ongoing. It wasn't a lie. I was investigating. I just didn't know yet what I was looking for. Her name took me 3 days to find. Not her full name. That came later, and it came like a building falling down, which I'll get to. But the shape of a name, the end of one, That took 3 days. The first 2 days I spent at the standard protocols. I ran her physical profile through every registry database the station subscribes to, covers 47 member nations of the Confederation and 12 observer states, plus the refugee tracking networks for the 6 active conflict zones that feed the most traffic through Cathara. No match. I ran her species classification deeper. Velhari subtype, which has its own subset of registries, its own family of language databases, its own constellation of potential nations of origin. No match on any of it. She sat in Bay 9. The intake aides were professional with her. Professional is a wide category, and some of what lived inside it, in that bay during that period, was impatience. And was some of it's the kind of brusqueness that happens when people are understaffed and under pressure, and the person in front of them can't communicate. She wasn't hurt. She was just handled the way an intake number gets handled when there isn't enough time to see a person behind it. I noticed this and said something to the bay supervisor, who adjusted the assigned staff with good grace and no argument to her credit. But the thing that was more immediately urgent was food. She wasn't eating. The main hall for meal service is large and loud. 600 occupants of the transit wing all eating at rotating shifts, the ambient noise of that many people. Plus the ventilation system, plus the PA announcement running 3 language tracks simultaneously. I'd seen it overwhelm transit arrivals before. I understood it theoretically. But watching her stand at the entrance to the hall on the second day, the noise hitting her like a physical thing, her face going tight and careful, body turning back before she'd taken 3 steps in. I understood it more concretely. I talked to the commissary supervisor. Then I started bringing 2 portions to Bay 9, and sitting across from her at the low table near the window that looks out at the landing apron, I'd put the food in front of her and eat my own and not make it a condition that she eat, and not try to talk, and not perform patience in a way she don't have to manage. I just ate my lunch and let the silence be what it was. The first day she watched me. The second day she watched the food. The third day she started eating. It was on that third day that she said the word. She was watching a transport on the landing apron. A Confederation bulk carrier. Nothing interesting. Just a big gray hull being loaded with relief supplies. The loaders moving in their methodical route from dock to cargo hatch and back. And she said, a word. Just one. Softly, almost to herself, the way people sometimes speak when they see something that connects to something else. When a thing in the present pulls at a thread from before. My translation unit didn't catch it. I looked at her. She said it again, slightly differently inflected, as if trying to find the version that carried the meaning she wanted. And she pointed at the ship. I pulled up my unit's deep archive and ran the phoneme string. The deep archive is a secondary database that most intake workers never use because it covers dialect variants outside the current language registries, historical forms, extinct branches, linguistics river-to-seas of civilizations that don't exist anymore, but whose speakers sometimes still do. Running a phoneme search through it is slow. I let it run, and while it was running I said, ship, and pointed at the carrier. Then I pointed at her and waited. She looked at me for a long moment, reading the situation, deciding what it was, deciding whether it was safe to participate. Then she said the word again, and this time the inflection was questioning, like she was asking whether I was the same thing she was. Stranded, uncertain, trying to find the right word for where we were. I said Dale, and pointed at myself. She considered this. Then she touched her own sternum, very lightly, and said something that my unit caught only the end of. 2 syllables. The second one sounded like Reva. The first syllable was not clear. There was something preceding it that my unit hadn't captured at sufficient resolution. I wrote it down. I wrote it phonetically in 3 different transliteration systems because I didn't know which one would match anything, and I filed it in her notes under subject self-identification attempt with the annotation, partial phoneme capture. Additional context required. I called her Sareva after that. I didn't know if that was right or if I was only catching part of it, but she didn't correct me, and after the first few times she heard it, she would look up when I said it. And that felt like enough of a confirmation to proceed on. Administrator Perev called me into her office on day 19. Perev ran transit intake for the entire Cathura reach. which meant she had authority over roughly 6,000 active cases at any given time, and a staffing budget that had been cut twice in the past 3 years, and a directness that I respected even when it was aimed at me like it was right now. She had a way of looking at you over the top of a datapad that communicated, without words, that she had more important problems than you, and was giving you this conversation as a courtesy. She gave me that look and said, Bay 9, Velhari Unclaimed, your case you filed an extension. Yes. On what grounds? Active investigation, insufficient identity data. Dale. She set the datapad down. She has no chip. She has no registry match in any of the 47 member databases. She has no language match in any current reference database. She's been non-responsive to standard intake processing for 19 days. She's flagged on three separate aid reports as requiring specialized intervention that this station does not have the staffing capacity to provide. She folded her hands on the desk. What exactly are you investigating? She gave me a partial name, 2 syllables. I'm running phony match against deep archive Velhari variants. I'm also cross-referencing her physical profile against Velhari historical lineage boards, which have a longer response time than the current registries. Perev looked at me with the expression of someone who is technically within procedure but is making your caseload numbers worse. The Deep Archive Velhari Dialect Database covers dialects that have been dead for 300 years, some of them. Others go back further. There was a major cultural disruption in Velhari history about 800 years ago, the Sundering. That wiped out large portions of the language record. The Monastery Tree archives on Velhari Prime are the primary surviving source, and they're not fully integrated into the standard databases. Perev was quiet for a moment that had a specific quality to it. Not skepticism. Exactly. But the focused evaluation of someone who is deciding whether an argument she finds implausible might nevertheless be correct. If there's a match, she said, what does it tell you? That she speaks a dialect no one has used in 3 centuries. It tells me something about the house she comes from. Velhari naming conventions in the pre-sundering period were lineage-specific. The naming council of each house used a distinct dialect root set when naming children. If her name matches a root set, tells me which house she belongs to. Which house she might belong to. Which house she might belong to, I agreed. Perev picked up her datapad. You have until day 45. After that I need that file resolved or I'm routing it to the transit queue. I'm not running an open-ended hold on a non-responsive unclaimed case with no supporting documentation. Understood. And Dale. She looked at me again. And this time the look was different. Not the administrator look. Something quieter underneath it. The look of a person who has been running a humanitarian intake station for 14 years. And has not yet lost track of what the caseload numbers actually represent. If she needs medical beyond what the intake nurse can provide, use the station budget line, not the emergency aid queue. Don't make her wait. I thanked her and left. I spent the next 4 evenings in the archive. It is housed in a server room on level 6 that nobody uses much anymore, where the cooling unit constantly, and the light is the particular shade of gray that makes everything look like a historical document. The thing about the Velhari is that they are very old. I don't mean old the way the Confederation is old, which is a few thousand years of continuous recorded governance, with gaps and rewrites, and the usual human tendency to call things permanent that last longer than a generation. I mean old the way a geological formation is old. You look at the strata and you realize the thing you're standing on has been accumulating since before anything you know about existed. The Velhari Compact, in its current form, is roughly 1100 years old. Before the Compact there were the Velhari Principalities, which lasted about 800 years, and collapsed in what the historical record calls the Sundering, which was a civil conflict, so severe it wiped out 4 of the 7 original royal bloodlines and destroyed about 40% of Velhari cultural infrastructure, including most of the language records from the pre-sundering period, which is why the Deep Archive Velhari dialect database is incomplete, disorganized, composed mostly of fragments recovered from ruins, and the monastery on Velhari Prime that kept copying old texts as a religious practice without necessarily understanding what it was preserving. It's the kind of archive that was built by people doing their best with what survived, rather than people who had the luxury of doing it properly. I find I have more patience with archives like that than with the clean, orderly ones. The clean, orderly ones carry implicit assumptions about what's worth keeping. The messy ones were built by someone who didn't have the luxury of deciding in advance what mattered. The monastery archive was particularly interesting. It was housed, digitally, in a subdirectory of the academic commons that had been uploaded once and never significantly updated, which meant it still had the original formatting from the academic team that had digitized it decades ago. Clunky, inconsistent, with metadata that was sometimes in 3 different languages and sometimes in none at all. But the content itself was extraordinary. The monks had been copying texts for religious reasons, not preservation reasons, and so they had copied things that a preservation-minded archivist might have deemed too fragmentary or too obscure to bother with. Household records, naming documents, the small ceremonial texts that accompanied births and namings and betrothals and deaths in the pre-sundering houses, private liturgies that each house used when marking the significant passages of its lineage. Most historical archives don't have those things. They have the great texts, the official records, the documents that somebody important decided were worth saving. The monastery had the equivalent of personal letters and family albums, preserved because nobody had decided they weren't sacred. The phoneme string I was running, that 2-syllable fragment, the ending that sounded like Reva, didn't match any registered Velhari dialect. On day 22, it returned a partial match against a pre-sundering dialect fragment preserved in the monastery records, cross-referenced through an academic linguistic database that a university somewhere had built and uploaded to the Galactic Academic Commons 15 years ago, and that almost nobody in intake work would ever have reason to know about. The match was only about 60%, which is below standard confidence threshold, but the associated entry was interesting enough that I kept reading. The root word, in that extinct dialect, was a concept that the academic notes translated carefully and with obvious uncertainty. It had to do with the idea of permanence under loss. Specifically, the quality of something that continues to exist when everything that's sustained it has been taken away. Not survivals in the sense of struggling. Survival in the sense of simply being the kind of thing that remains. The way a mountain remains after everything built on it has crumbled. The monastery translator, who had worked with this fragment centuries ago, had written in his marginalia, "The one who endures," but I am uncertain whether endures is the right word, because the word implies effort, and the root implies that this is simply what the thing is. I sat with that for a while, in the gray light of the level 6 server room. Then I started looking at velhari naming conventions, which turned out to be a field of study with a small but passionate literature and several competing theoretical frameworks, and at least one very long ongoing argument in the academic comments of the primary monograph that had clearly been running for decades. In pre-sundering velhari culture, personal names were not chosen by parents. They were chosen by the naming council of the child's house, a body of elders and scholars, whose specific function was to look at the lineage, at the needs of the house over the coming generation, at the qualities the house had lost or was in danger of losing, and choose a name that called those qualities into being. The name was not a description of who the child was. It was a statement of what the house needed that life to carry, a naming that reached forward rather than backward. Thought about that for a long time. If her name was Sareva, or something close to it, if the root I'd found was the right one, then somewhere, between 300 and 800 years ago, depending on when this dialect branch was last in active use, council had looked at an infant and decided that this was the life that would carry permanence forward. This was the one the house was asking to be the thing that remained. I filed a secondary extension on her case that night. Reason: cultural heritage investigation, pre-sundering velhari lineage markers, pending biological cross-reference with velhari compact historical registry. The velhari compact historical registry, I should note, takes approximately 30 days to respond to non-urgent information requests from non-member stations. I filed it as urgent on the grounds of humanitarian case resolution with potential diplomatic implications. bumped it to a 15-day queue. Then I kept working. She started talking on day 28. Not fluently. Not in anything my translation unit could process reliably. But she started, haltingly, long pauses and obvious frustration at the gaps between what she was trying to say and what was coming out, in a mixture of the handful of common trade words she'd picked up from watching the intake hall, and the pre-sundering root words that my archive access had begun to teach me, both of us working with incomplete maps of the same territory, guessing at the topography from different angles. I want to be accurate about what those early conversations were like, because I've seen them described since, in ways that make them sound more elegant than they were. They weren't elegant. They were slow and patient, and often frustrating and occasionally funny, the particular kind of funny that belongs to two people who are both trying very hard, and both failing and can see each other failing and keep going. Anyway, she would find a word in the pre-sundering route. I would try to build a context around it, using what I'd learned from the archive. She would watch my face to see if the context was right. Her face was extremely readable for those evaluations, which I suspected was not her natural default. But she had learned that I needed the feedback, and she gave it. And if the context was wrong, she'd try again, and if it was right, she would nod once, sharply, the velhari way, chin down and brief, like a confirmation being logged. What emerged, over those early weeks, assembled slowly from fragments. She had been on a transport, a civilian liner. She didn't remember the ship's name or its departure point or its destination. There had been an event. She was certain of this. The certainty was in her voice, even when the words weren't. But the pre-sundering root word she used for it, translated as breaking from outside, could mean a military strike or a structural failure, or a natural disaster or several other things, and she didn't have the common trade vocabulary yet to distinguish them. She had been in an escape pod. The pod had been picked up by a refugee transit vessel already running above capacity, and she had been processed as an anonymous arrival. And then she had been transferred through the transit system 3 times in quick succession, and chip housing had been cracked at some point in one of those transfers. She didn't know which one. She'd been barely conscious for parts of the transit period. She didn't know how long she had been in transit before she reached Cathara. Her sense of time, she communicated to me with obvious frustration and what I recognized as embarrassment. She did not like not knowing things had become unreliable. The trauma of the event and the weeks in transit had disordered something in her sense of sequence. Things she was certain were recent might be months old. Things she thought were far behind her might have been last week. "How long have I been here?" she asked me once. Not in those words exactly, but in a combination of gestures and root words and common trade fragments that assembled into that. 31 days, I said. She absorbed this, counted something internally. Then she said with deliberate care, working through each word, "Or here. Long, the transit records are incomplete. I'm still trying to piece it together." She nodded, the sharp velhari acknowledgement, and looked out the window. Then she said something in the root language that my unit couldn't parse at full confidence. When I asked her to repeat it, she said, in common trade, "I do not remember, I know." I said, "I remember." She stopped. She touched the side of her head, just above her temple, where the faint blue undertone of her skin was most visible. "Remember, there is something large. Important, I cannot find it." "That's all right," I said. She looked at me, the pale gold eyes, the vertical pupils, steady and complicated and carrying something I didn't have the right vocabulary for yet. "It is not all right," she said. "You are kind to say so." That was the first complete sentence in Contrade that my unit could parse cleanly without guesswork. I wrote it down in her case file. Not because it was relevant to the administrative record, because I wanted to remember it. The sessions at the table by the window became the anchor of the day. I rearranged my shift schedule slightly to make them more regular. I owed 3 weeks of unused lunch breaks, so this was not a hardship administratively. Though Perev noted the schedule change and gave me a look when I passed her in the corridor that communicated awareness without comment. I brought the food. I brought the tea. Once the nutritionist had helped me identify the velhari-compatible options. I brought, after the second week, a second data tablet loaded with language acquisition modules that I'd found in the Educational Resource Library, supplemented with material I'd pulled from the archive and formatted myself, because the standard modules did not have a pre-sundering velhari component. She was an extraordinary learner. I want to be precise about this because it matters to the story. It wasn't merely that she was intelligent, though she clearly was. It was the combination of intelligence with a kind of structured patience. She would work at something until she had it, not until she was tired, with a methodical quality that suggested she had been trained to learn this way, had been doing it, since before she could remember, in the context where it had mattered. And there were moments, in those sessions, where something would click in a way that felt less like acquisition and more like retrieval. She'd hear a root word, and her expression would shift slightly. Not just recognition, but something deeper. A word landing not in her short-term processing, but in some older layer underneath it, like a word returning to where it had always lived, rather than being filed somewhere new. One afternoon in the third week, I was working through a section of the monastery archive that dealt with the ceremonial language used in formal court addresses, highly formal, archaic, the kind of register that would only have been used on state occasions. I read a phrase aloud, slowly, working out the pronunciation from the phonetic guides. She looked up from her tablet. I read it again. She said it back to me, and the difference between my version and hers was significant. Not the words, but everything around them. The cadence was different. The weight distribution across the syllables was different. She spoke it the way you speak something that has been spoken for reasons, not the way you read something from a page. And then she stopped, and she looked at the window, and her expression was the expression I had come to associate with something surfacing from underneath. "Where did you learn that?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't know." And then slowly working through it, "I know it, from inside. Not from being told," she searched. "From saying it, many times, before." I wrote that in my notes that night in capital letters with 3 underlines. From inside. Saying it. Many times, before. She started teaching me in return, somewhere around the same time. She would hear me use a pre-sundering root and correct my inflection. And the correction was always precise. Always slightly different from what any recorded source suggested. Not wrong. More like the source was describing the map, and she was walking the actual ground. I started keeping a separate set of notements from those corrections. They accumulated into something that felt important, though I didn't know yet exactly why. Perev pushed back on day 38. She called me in again, this time with a data pad full of the full caseload numbers for Bay 9, and a specific concern about the resource allocation I'd been running through the station educational budget for the tablet subscriptions. The conversation was brief and direct, and ended with me agreeing to make a formal recommendation for the case within the week, and Perev making a formal notation in her own log that she had raised the issue with me, which I understood was her covering the administrative record the way she always did. What I did not tell Perev was that the Velhari Compact Historical Registry had sent me a preliminary response 2 days earlier, flagged priority historical, asking for clarification on several aspects of my inquiry and requesting a biological sample for cross-reference. I had read that message 4 times. I was still processing what it meant, or what it might mean, and I wanted to have more certainty before I brought it to anyone else. The next day, I went to the Bay 9 common area with the archive material I'd been building, and I sat down with Sareva and I said, "I have some things I want to show you. Tell me if any of it is familiar." I pulled up the pre-sundering images first. Not the lineage-specific ones, just the historical artwork, the cultural records, the visual texture of the world the pre-sundering velhari had lived in. Court scenes, ceremonial events, the architectural style of the great houses. I watched her face while she looked at them. She was very still. "These are old," she said finally, in her careful common trade. "Very old. 800 years, approximately." She nodded, looking at the screen. Then she said, almost to herself, in the pre-sundering route, "The shape is right." I waited. She looked at me. "The shape," she said again, in common trade, and moved her hand in a gesture that seemed to encompass the images, and also something larger, something beyond the screen. It is, I have seen this shape before, not these pictures. But this, she searched for the word. This way of making things. Does it feel like a memory? I asked. Long pause. It feels like something I knew before I knew it, she said. I pulled up the next set. The linguistic charts. The naming conventions. The house records. And then, carefully, the entry on the house of Serev. She looked at the screen for a long time. Then she said slowly, "This house. Yes, it is gone. It was believed to be gone. For 8 centuries. The compact has been uncertain." I chose my next words with care. The registry has been tracking something. An indirect lineage trail through 800 years of records. They believe there may be a surviving branch. She looked at me. They would like to cross-reference, I said. With you, if you're willing. It is entirely your choice. She was quiet. Outside, the landing apron lights had come on. The afternoon shift change, the dock lights cycling on for the evening. The pale gold of her eyes caught the light from the window, and for a moment they looked almost amber, warmer, closer to the color of old firelight. If they test, she said, and they find something, then the registry would notify the appropriate authorities in the compact. Come here. Yes. Or wherever you choose to be. She looked at the historical images on the screen again. The stylized figures, the formal compositions, the eyes rendered with unusual care and precision, because the house had believed the eyes were where the soul persisted. My name, she said very quietly. I said it to you once, the end of it. Yes, there is more. She closed her eyes. I waited. The server room quality of the silence in the common area, the hum of the station around us, the distant murmur of the intake hall. I can almost. She stopped. She opened her eyes. They were wet, but she was not crying. She was very carefully not crying, holding herself in the posture of someone who will not be undone by this, not here, not now. It is there, she said. I can feel it. Cannot reach it. It will come back, I said. The specialists say this kind of thing comes back in fragments. The registry has medical expertise with exactly Dale. My name in her precise pronunciation. I stopped. Do you believe it? She asked. For what the registry thinks. I thought about the phony match and the archive and the images and the specific quality of her corrections to my pre-sundering inflections, the ground-level accuracy that no linguistic database had. I thought about the naming council and the word for the one who endures. I said yes. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, in common trade, all right, I will let them test. I filed the biological sample request with the registry that evening. I also filed a third extension on her case. Reason, active diplomatic inquiry pending. Status, ongoing. On day 39, 6 days before Perev's extended deadline, the full cross-reference response came in. I was at window 3 when the notification hit. The shift was quiet. A Corvith family group working through naturalization paperwork, which is detailed and slow. Pair of Drenathi students with visas requiring reissuance. Ordinary work, the kind that runs on its own momentum if you let it. Shh. I pulled up the notification on my secondary screen and read it, and then I read it again, and then I sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, while the Corfoth father politely pretended not to notice. The response was flagged priority historical, a designation I had never seen applied to anything in my 11 years at window 3. The text was careful and precise, and said what it said without equivocation. The biological cross-reference was a confirmed match. The lineage trail the registry had been following for 200 years. The indirect, uncertain, almost theoretical trail through 8 centuries of records after the sundering led here. Led to Bay 9 of Cathara Transit Station, a border moon humanitarian intake facility at the edge of the Confederation Reach, was about as far as you could get from the formal geography of the Velhari Compact, while technically still being in the same galactic neighborhood. The response laid out what this meant. The pre-sundering house of Serev, believed extinguished, was not extinguished. Primary branch, dormant and unlocated for 8 centuries, had a surviving member. And the Velhari Compact had been in an 11-year succession dispute, because the imperial seat had been held in regency after the death of the previous Empress, with no confirmed heir, a situation that 4 competing claimant factions had been exploiting with varying degrees of willingness to use force. And the reason the succession dispute existed was that the legitimate line had been considered lost since the sundering. I closed the message. I looked out at the intake hall. I thought about the woman in Bay 9 who couldn't reach the large important thing in her memory, and the monastery that it kept copying words nobody understood, and the naming council that had looked at a child 800 years ago and decided this was the one the house needed to carry permanence forward. I went to find Perev. The administrator's office at 6 in the evening has a particular quality. The main desk lights are usually dimmed, PA announcements have dropped to half frequency, and Perev herself transitions into a mode that is still working but more quietly. Problems being maintained rather than actively solved. She looked up when I knocked and gestured me in. I handed her my secondary screen with the full registry response pulled up. She read it. I watched her face. Is usually a study in controlled professional composure. I watched her read the first paragraph, pause, and read it again. Then she read the rest of it through without stopping. And when she reached the end, she sat back in her chair and looked at me with the expression of someone who needs exactly 30 seconds before they can be useful. She took them, and she said, "Is she in Bay 9? Yes. Is she safe and stable? Yes. She's been improved significantly. Her language recovery has been. I'm issuing a security upgrade on Bay 9 tonight." Ev's voice had shifted into the mode I recognized as her active decision register, precise and fast. Full access restriction, biometric lock on the corridor, 2 station security officers on rotation. Not a confinement measure. I'll explain that to her, and I'd like you present when I do. A protection measure. From, Perev looked at me. The succession dispute has 4 factions, 2 of which have used violence in the past 8 years. If anyone outside this office identifies what the registry just confirmed before the compact's formal delegation arrives, this station becomes a target. She picked up her primary pad and started moving through it with the focused efficiency of someone building a response protocol in real time. I'm sending an urgent diplomatic communique to the compact's Foreign Affairs office tonight. I want the delegation here within 10 days. I want a secure channel to the Confederation Humanitarian Oversight Office opened immediately so the court of this case is backed up off station before anything else happens. She looked up at me. How did she get here, Dale? Do we actually know? She'll picture. She was on a civilian liner. There was an event, she's described it as an attack, though she doesn't have the vocabulary yet to be specific. The transit records for her first 3 transfers are all incomplete, which the registry notes as consistent with a systematic identity disruption. The silence that followed that sentence was the specific silence of someone reaching a conclusion they don't want to confirm. Someone, Perev said, her in that system without a chip, and either counted on the system to lose her, or was actively tracking her through it and waiting for a convenient moment. That's the reading I've been afraid to write down. Write it down, she said. Write all of it down. I want the complete administrative record. Will every extension, every case note, every conversation log you kept, every archive request you filed, the language acquisition module records, the nutritionist consultations, the meal schedule deviations, everything. I want it formatted and filed with humanitarian oversight before the delegation lands. I want it to be a record that nobody can quietly make disappear, and I want it to be clear on what this station did and did not do and when. Why the meal schedule? Perev looked at me. Because when this story gets told, and it will get told, at a level of scrutiny neither of us is prepared for, I want the record to show that when she arrived here she was cared for. Not processed. Cared for. She paused. And because whoever put her in that system was counting on the system to treat her as a number, I want a document that demonstrates, line by line, that it did not. I filed everything that night. 11 years of intake experience, applied to the problem of making a record impossible to dismiss or quietly archive. It took until past midnight, and I drank much bad coffee from the level 3 machine, and the cooling units in the server room made their usual sound. When I was done, the record was thorough and cross-referenced and filed in 4 separate locations simultaneously, and it said, clearly and without interpretation, what had happened at Cathara Station over 63 days when an unclaimed Velhari woman with no chip and no language match and no name in any current database had come through window 3. On day 63, I told her. I had been trying to decide how to do it for 12 days. The question wasn't whether to tell her. That had never been in question. It was her information about her own life, and she was entitled to it. The question was how and when and what order to put things in, because the information was large and had implications that would land on her differently, depending on what else was in place when they arrived. She was stronger than she had been on day one, considerably stronger. But strong enough for this was a different calculation. I sat with her at the table by the window after the evening meal. The routine was established enough now that it had its own particular comfort. The tea, the tablet, the light on the apron, the easy silence between sessions. I watched her finish a language module and set the tablet aside, and I said, "I need to tell you something important, and I need you to know that none of it changes what happens here at this station. You're not going anywhere until you choose to. That is not going to change." She looked at me over the tea, pale gold eyes reading my face, with the precision she had always applied to reading me. "Tell me," I told her. I was careful about the order, the lineage, what the archive had found, what the naming convention meant, what the House of Serev was, then the cross-reference, then gently, what the registry believed the cross-reference implied. I left the succession dispute and the factions and the security measures for a separate conversation with Perev present, because those had a different weight and required her to be in a different mode to receive them. What I gave her, sitting at the window on day 63, was this. Your name is a very old word that means the one who endures. The house that gave you that name was one of the 7 original royal houses of the Velhari people. It was believed to have been destroyed 800 years ago. The registry has been looking for evidence of a surviving branch for 2 centuries. The biological cross-reference says you are that branch. You are the end of a lineage that 8 centuries of history thought was gone. She listened without interrupting. She held the tea in both hands, ash-gray fingers around the pale cup, and she looked at the table while I talked, not at me, the way she looked at things when she was giving them her full internal attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The large thing I could not reach." "Yes," I said, "it is this. I think so. I think your memory will continue to return. Registry has medical specialists who work specifically with." I stopped. She looked up from the table. The pale gold eyes, wet at the edges but not overflowing, holding something enormous with the careful discipline of someone who has been holding enormous things for a very long time. "How long have you known?" she said. 12 days. Why did you wait?" "Because I wanted you to be ready. Because I didn't want you to be alone with it before you had the words to carry it." She looked at me for a long moment. "No one," she said, "in the pre-sundering route, the dialect we had been building together from both sides, the language she knew from the inside and I knew from the archive, no one at this station." And then she stopped, because the words were there but they were too large, and she switched to common trade, speaking carefully. "No one was required to do what you did. None of it was required." "No," I said, "then why?" I thought about all the answers I could give. The true one was the simplest. "Because you sat in that chair in Bay 9, I said. And you looked at me, and you were deciding if I was a threat. And you were so careful about it, precise, like you were applying a standard you developed for good reasons. And I thought, whoever this person is, she was someone before whatever happened to her. She is still that person. And she deserves to have somebody act accordingly." She looked at me, the full weight of the pale gold eyes, and whatever was pressing behind them had made up its mind. And a single line of it ran down her cheek, and she let it. She did not raise her hand to stop it. "You called me Sareva," she said. "Yes. The first time you said it," she paused, thought, "someone is trying to find me. Someone is looking for the right word, a breath." I thought, I should help them. It was the first time in a long time that I thought that. I didn't say anything. "It was the first time," she said again, more quietly, "that I thought I was worth helping find." The Compact's delegation arrived on day 78, 12 of them, an envoy, 2 historians, a medical specialist, 4 court officials, and 4 armed guards whom Perev had negotiated down from the original, requested 8 through a diplomatic exchange that she characterized afterward as productive. They arrived on a gray and gold compact diplomatic vessel, long and narrow in the Velhari architectural style, and the landing apron was cleared for them, and Perev met them at the dock herself with two of our senior staff and the complete administrative record printed on physical media in addition to the digital copies, because Perev is thorough in ways that occasionally border on symbolic. I was not at the dock. I was in Bay 9 at the table by the window. Sareva had been quiet since early morning. Not the blankness of the first weeks, nothing like that, but a focused interior quiet, the kind that belongs to someone who is preparing. She had dressed carefully. Court attire the delegation had sent ahead the previous day. Deep gray, with a narrow gold border. The house colors from the historical records. Was folded on the bed, but she wasn't wearing it yet. She was in the station clothes she'd been wearing for weeks. The clean utilitarian gray that she had learned to wear with a dignity that made it look like a choice rather than an assignment. "Are you afraid?" I asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. She had stopped apologizing for honest answers sometime around week 5. I remember more now. The court, the chambers, the shape of what it was to be responsible for something large. She paused. I remember some of the people, faces. I remember that they mattered to me. I do not know yet if I remember correctly, or if what I remember is real or, she searched for the word. Constructed, I offered. Yes. Constructed from what I wanted to remember rather than what was. She looked at her hands. I do not know if I am the same person who carried all of it. You've been carrying it this whole time, I said. You just didn't have the name for it. She looked at me. That's what you do, I said. It's in your name. You endure. You were doing it before I met you and you'll do it after. I kept the file open. That's different. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite at a smile. The precursor of one. The acknowledgement of something that deserved to be recognized even if the moment was too complicated to let it fully become what it was. You kept the file open, she said. Somebody had to. She made the velhari acknowledgement, the chin-down nod, brief and precise, and looked back at the window. A transport was making its approach run on the far end of the apron, the running lights blinking their patient amber. She watched it. After today, she said, things will be very different. Yes, I do not know exactly how. I know the shape of it, the succession. She said the word carefully, as if checking its weight. Explained the situation to me this morning. I know. She told me she was going to. She is a good administrator. A pause. She reminds me of someone. From before, I cannot remember who yet. She'll take that as a compliment when you tell her. Sareva looked at me. Will you still be at window 3, she asked. After. That's my job, I said. Where else would I be? I thought perhaps. She stopped. I have no standing to offer you anything right now. But I would want you to know that whatever I am in a position to do, for this station, people who work here, I will do. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. That is the nature of a gift. The echo of her own earlier words, deliberate. You taught me that. Before I could answer, I heard them coming. The sound of the delegation moving through the Bay 9 corridor, particular acoustic of a formal group in formal boots on a station corridor. The voices of the court officials in their clipped velhari dialect. She heard it before I did. She stood up. She put her hands at her sides, and she straightened, and she became, in the space of 3 seconds, something that had always been there and was now simply visible. The envoy stopped in the doorway. He was tall, older, with the pale amber eyes that ran in the Sarev lineage, and the formal composure of a man who has spent his career managing difficult moments with grace. He had been doing his job, conducting the protocol, managing the verification process, preparing the formal acknowledgement. And then he looked at her, and he stopped doing his job because what he was looking at had made his job irrelevant. He took 3 steps into the room. He stopped. I was near the corridor wall where I had placed myself, close enough to see, far enough to be out of the way, felt like the right place to be for what was happening. Perev was at the door, still and watchful. The court officials had stilled behind the envoy. The room had acquired the quality of silence that descends when something is about to become imminent. The envoy's eyes moved across her face. The ash-gray skin, the pale gold eyes, the black hair grown out from the close crop, the posture. He had spent his career following the lineage trail. He knew, from the historical records and the academy databases, and 200 years of his institution searching, exactly what he was looking for. And now he was looking at it. His composure broke, just slightly, just at the jaw and around the eyes. Just enough for anyone watching to understand that what had been a professional certainty had become something else, had become the thing underneath the professional certainty that had been driving it for his entire career. He raised right fist to his left shoulder. The old, pre-sundering formal acknowledgement, the one preserved only in the historical records, the one that had been replaced by later court conventions, and was now kept only for the most formal of formal occasions, or when formality had become something too real for its later versions to carry. His hand to his shoulder, and his head down, beat. And when he raised his eyes again, they were the eyes of someone who has been searching for something for a very long time, and has found it in a place he did not expect and is not entirely prepared for what that means. Behind him in the doorway, two of the court officials had performed the same gesture without, I think, consciously deciding to. It had moved through the formation the way certain things move through a group of people who share a history. Not a decision, a reflex, something that the body knows before the mind catches up with it. He said something in the Velhari court dialect. My unit gave me a rough translation. We believed you were lost. We never stopped looking. The words themselves were inadequate to the register his voice put them in. Sareva looked at him for a long moment. She was reading his face the way she read everything. Precisely, completely, giving it her full attention. And whatever she found there, in the face of this man who had spent his career following a 200-year institutional search to this transit station on a border moon, she seemed to arrive at a conclusion about it. She said something back, 3 words in the pre-sundering route, and my unit offered. I remained. I am still here. The envoy's composure cracked again, more visibly this time, and he let it. He was not a young man, and whatever wall he had built between his professional function and whatever he personally felt about this search, he set it down. Deliberately. Right there in the Bay 9 common area with the landing apron visible through the window and the commissary smell in the air and the station running its ordinary hum underneath everything. The medical specialist moved forward. There was a brief, quiet exchange, the envoy deferring to her choice, Sareva considering and then nodding, holding out her arm. The scanner ran. The specialist looked at the result. The specialist's face said, "This is the thing I have been working toward for the entirety of my professional career, and I am not prepared for the fact that it is real, and it is here and it is now. Confirmed, on the record, in a transit station on a border moon at the edge of the Confederation reach, in a common area with a view of a landing apron, at a table by a window where someone had been eating lunch with a case file open for 63 days. Confirmed. 2 of the court officials were not as composed as the envoy. They had the faces of people who had been maintaining a professional posture around a private grief for a very long time, and the professional posture was no longer fully available to them. I watched them and thought about the administrative record I had built, about all the reasons Perev had told me to build it, about 7 months in the transit system, and a destroyed chip and an intake chair, and 2 syllables. I stayed near the corridor wall and I was quiet, and I let the moment be what it was. Spent 2 days on the station, completing the formal documentation and the medical assessment and the security review and the preliminary diplomatic protocols that apparently need to happen when a missing sovereign is verified at a transit station with no formal diplomatic standing. Perev managed all of it with her usual efficiency and a firmness regarding station jurisdiction that I found genuinely admirable, and that, the envoy, I was told, described in his official report as unexpectedly rigorous, which I chose to read as a compliment. I had one conversation with the envoy directly, on the second morning, in the corridor outside the Bay 9 administrative office. He had sought me out, which I hadn't expected. He was formal but direct, the way people are when they have something specific they want to say, and are going to say it correctly. He said that the case record I had built was extraordinary. He said that in his 32 years of diplomatic work, he had read many institutional records, and that the record I had built was the kind that changed the way institutions thought about what they were doing. He said that the care documented in it, the meal accommodations, the language sessions, the archive work, the extensions filed, had been read by the medical specialist, and the 2 historians and all 4 court officials, and that several of them had needed to take a moment before they could continue reading. I told him I had done my job. He said gently that what the record documented was considerably more than a job, and that he understood if I preferred to frame it that way, and that the compact would nonetheless ensure the record reflected what it actually was. I thanked him and went back to window 3. On the second evening, Sareva asked to meet with me alone. The table by the window. Last time we both understood, though neither of us said it directly. She had made the tea. The landing apron was dark outside, the compact vessel's running lights gray and gold against the black of the moon's sky. The envoy has told me more about the situation, she said. The attack on my transport was not an accident. One of the claimant factions. They believed the matter was resolved. Perev told me this morning. They did not account for a number of things. She looked at the tea in her hands. They did not account for an intake worker with a deep archives subscription and an extended capacity for filing extensions. No, I said. I imagine they didn't model for that. You built something here, she said. The case file. Perev showed it to me. I have read it, all of it. She looked up. You built a record that makes it impossible to tell this story any other way than the way it happened. You made it so that the only version of events that exists is the one in which I was found, in which someone decided, on day 1, that the system's answer was wrong. I didn't say anything. You did this, she said, without knowing what I was, without knowing that it would matter to anyone beyond this station. It mattered to you, I said. That was enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her inner sleeve pocket and put something on the table between us. A small piece of metal, roughly triangular, dark with age, the edges worn smooth, old clearly, something that had been carried for a long time. This was in the pod, she said. The only thing in the personal effects storage. I don't remember how it came to be there. I've been carrying it since the first transit station. Because, she paused. Because it was mine. I was certain of that even when I was certain of nothing else. And I have been waiting to understand what it was for. I picked it up. It was warm from being carried, and lighter than it looked. On one face of it, worn but visible, was a mark. An old-form velhari character, the kind the monastery records had preserved. I had learned enough of the pre-sundering script by now to read it. The character meant, "What remains?" I looked up at her. "Know what your name means," she said. I looked it up, the human root, the old one. What does it mean? The valley. The low place between high places. The place where the water comes when it runs down from the heights. The place where things are gathered. She looked at me steadily. Where things are kept. I closed my hand around the piece of metal. When I am in a position to act, she said, Kethera Station will not be unknown to the compact. Perev will receive a formal commendation. The humanitarian record you built will be used as a model for how processing should function, and as a document of how it failed before it found its way here. Sareva, I know, she said, you don't need it. You need the record to say that you found her. I know. She looked at me. It will say that. It will say it clearly and permanently, and in the kind of language that doesn't fade. You kept the file open. That will be known. We sat at the table until the commissary lights dimmed for the evening cycle. We didn't fill the silence. There was nothing the silence needed that wasn't already in it. She left the next morning at the 7th hour. I was at window 3 for the morning shift. The Korvath family from the naturalization queue had returned with their final documentation, and I was working through it with them when I heard the change in the intake hall. The small atmospheric shift that happens when a formal group enters, the unconscious adjustment of movement when people sense something different is passing through. Several of the people in the intake hall had stopped. Not to obstruct, they gave the delegation room, but because people know, at a level below articulation, when they are witnessing something. The intake hall at Kethera is not ordinarily the location for anything that history would care about. Most of the people in it on any given day are carrying something urgent and personal and specific to themselves, and they have limited bandwidth for anything beyond that. But some of them stopped and watched, and I thought about what they were seeing. Not the court attire, or the formal guard formation, or the gray and gold diplomatic insignia, but the thing underneath all of that. The thing that had been sitting at the table by the window in Bay 9 for 63 days. The thing that had been in the transit system for 7 months before that, and was now walking through an ordinary intake hall on an ordinary border moon and going home. I looked up. She was in the middle of the delegation, court attire now, deep gray with the gold border, the house colors, and she wore it with the posture she had been building back one beam at a time for 2 months, straight and steady, and carrying something. Court officials moved in their formal ranks around her. The envoy was at her right. The guards were at the edges of the formation. She was looking straight ahead. Moving in the formal pace, the one I recognized from the historical descriptions of velhari court processionals, pace that says, "This is what this is, and I am what I am, and there is no uncertainty in either." She looked up as she passed window 3. She looked at me for 3 seconds. No more. The delegation was moving, and she moved with them. And there were 40 things happening around her that required her attention. But in those 3 seconds, she looked at me with the full weight of the pale gold eyes. And what was in them was something I don't have a word for in any language I know. Something that was recognition and gratitude, and something else underneath both of those. The thing that lives in people who have been the one who endures for a very long time, and know what it costs and know what it means to have someone understand that cost without requiring them to explain it. Then she looked forward and walked on. I watched her until the delegation turned the corner at the docking corridor and the hall returned to its ordinary frequency. The Corvith woman at my window said quietly, "Was that who I think it was?" "Yes," I said. I looked back at the naturalization forms. "She was a case here, she's going home." The Corvith woman nodded. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said something to her husband in their own language, something short and soft. And he nodded too, and they both looked at the corridor, where the delegation had gone, and then we got back to the paperwork, which still needed to be done. I closed the file that afternoon. In the field for case disposition, subject located and identified. Case resolved in the affirmative. Identity confirmed. Subject departed in the care of her people. In the field for case notes, final entry. She remembered who she was. It took time. She had help. I saved it. I let the system's archive routine take it. I sat at window 3 for a while longer, listening to the intake hall do what it always does. Move and wait and worry and hope and carry things that can't be put down. Then I pulled up the next case in the queue. The amber flag was on. Designation chip absent. Case flagged unclaimed. I read the species classification. I read the transit intake notes. I read the recommendation for transit purge at day 90. I filed an extension. Reason: insufficient identity data. Active investigation ongoing. Then I looked up at the person in the intake chair across the window, and I held up both hands, palms out, and I said, "My name is Dale. I'm going to try to help you. Can you understand any of these words?" She